Tonight, I'm sharing 6 chilling encounters that happened while people were home alone. The first story comes from a teenager babysitting her younger brother who saw something staring at them through the garden window. And by the end, you'll understand why she never stayed in that house alone again. If eerie horror like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Marissa, who was 16 at the time. Her parents had gone out to dinner, leaving her in charge of her 8-year-old brother, Danny. It was early December, one of those nights when frost patterns spiderweb across the windows and every sound outside seems magnified by the cold. Their house sat at the edge of a cul-de-sac, with a fenced backyard that opened onto a narrow strip of woods. It wasn't the kind of place you thought of as unsafe. Quiet neighborhood, friendly families, porch lights glowing warmly in the distance. Marissa had babysat Danny dozens of times before. They ordered pizza, watched a movie, and by 10 o'clock, Danny was yawning. She tucked him into bed, turned off the light, and went downstairs to the living room, phone in hand. That was when she noticed it. The back garden window, a wide pane of glass looking out onto the yard, had fogged over with the night frost. And pressed against it, just visible through the pale mist, was the shape of a face. Not close, not pressed up like in horror movies, just standing there, faintly lit by the porch light. A man, tall, shoulders squared, features indistinct in the frost, but unmistakably human. Marissa froze, her heart thudding so loud she swore he must hear it. She blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of condensation, but when she shifted an inch to the left, the figure shifted too, as if keeping its gaze fixed on her. She scrambled for logic. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe someone had cut through their yard by mistake, but no. There was no movement, no knock, no call, just the still presence of someone who shouldn't have been there. Gathering courage, she snapped off the living room light, plunging herself into shadow. The figure didn't move. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and switched on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The light bounced off the frost, glare washing out the glass for a moment. When it cleared, nothing. The man was gone. Her breath came in gasps, but part of her told herself it had to be her imagination, a shadow, a reflection. She got up, walked cautiously to the window, and pressed her hand against the cold pane. Outside, the yard was empty. The garden lights showed nothing but frozen grass and the line of trees beyond the fence. Relief started to settle until she noticed the ground. The frost that had settled evenly over the lawn was broken. Just beyond the window, in the perfect outline of where the man had stood, the grass was bare. Frost melted away in the shape of 2 shoes. No footprints led toward the fence. No marks showed someone leaving. Just the impression of someone who had stood there, staring. Marissa's stomach dropped. She locked every door in the house, double-checked the windows, and crept upstairs to check on Danny. He was fast asleep, clutching his stuffed bear, oblivious to the terror downstairs. But Marissa couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her room listening to the house settle, the furnace hum, the faint tick of pipes. Every creak felt magnified, every shadow stretching too far. It was just after 2 in the morning when she heard it again. Not from the living room this time, from her bedroom window. The faintest scrape, like a finger brushing across the glass. She sat up, her pulse hammering, and turned toward the window. At first, all she saw was the frost, thick white across the pane. But then, slowly, a shape emerged in it. A hand. Fingers dragging slowly downward, leaving streaks where the frost melted away. Marissa clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She bolted from her bed, grabbed Danny from his room, and locked them both in the upstairs bathroom. She whispered through the door to her brother, telling him it was a game, that they had to be very quiet. He curled against her, confused but obedient. For an hour she sat there, barely breathing, ears straining. Once she swore she heard footsteps creaking across the roof. Another time she thought she heard the back garden door handle rattle. But eventually, the house fell silent again. When her parents came home just before 3, Marissa was still in the bathroom, pale and trembling. She burst into tears when she saw them. Her father checked the yard immediately. Nothing. No footprints in the frost, no sign of forced entry. He told her it must have been her imagination or maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But Marissa insisted on what she saw. The face, the melted footprints, the hand on the glass. And the next morning when daylight returned, her father had no explanation for the streaks on her bedroom window. Long, uneven marks in the frost, starting high, dragging down, as if someone had been standing outside the roof. To this day, Marissa avoids garden windows after dark. She says she can still picture the man's faint outline, silent, watching, leaving no trace except melted frost that proved he'd been there. Before you go, would you have stayed in that house after seeing that face or left with your brother? Share your answer in the comments. Your story might be featured in a future video. If eerie horror like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. The second story comes from a college student who agreed to house sit for a professor over winter break and kept hearing a single chair scrape across the upstairs floor, over and over, though the professor swore nothing in that room had been moved for years. By the end, you'll understand why he never spends the night in other people's houses anymore. If slow burn horror like this hooks you, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Theo, a 20-year-old English major who needed extra cash between semesters. His adjunct professor, Dr. Bell, was leaving town for 2 weeks and wanted someone to feed the cat, water the temperamental ficus, and keep an eye on the pipes if the weather dropped. "It's an old colonial," she warned, half apologetic. "Drafts, quirks. You know how houses get when they're stubborn." The keys clinked warm into Theo's palm. One brass for the front door, a smaller one with blue nail polish on the head for the mudroom, and a bent skeleton key that made him joke, "Secret passage?" She just smiled too quickly, like someone remembering a joke's punchline and deciding not to tell it. "Interior door upstairs," she said. "You won't need it." The house sat a few blocks off campus where the streets traded students and pizza shops for porches with wind chimes and retired professors' mailboxes. 2 stories, cedar shingles gone gray with age, a low front porch, and inside, hardwood floors that spoke up about every step. The first afternoon felt cozy instead of creepy. Thin winter sun pouring through lace cartons, a tea kettle that screamed like it had important news, the cat, Pepper, weaving around Theo's ankles with a rattle in her throat that meant either affection or disdain. He set his backpack by the coat rack, texted a thank you to Dr. Bell for the job, and promised to send photos of the ficus when he remembered. The layout was simple. Living room on the left with a fireplace that was mostly decoration, study on the right with a mahogany desk under a bay window, dining room beyond that, kitchen tacked on the back like an afterthought. The staircase split the house in 2, climbing to a narrow upstairs hall with 3 doors, bath at the top, bedroom with a quilted bedspread to the right, and to the left, a door with old paint and a keyhole that looked like an eye closed tight. He tried the knob once, purely because you always try a closed door in a new place. It didn't budge. Interior door, he remembered. The skeleton key sat like a dare in his pocket. He left it there. The first night was ordinary, in the ways that matter. He heated a can of soup. He put his feet on the coffee table and pretended to read. He sent a photo of Pepper to the group chat,
captioned "My Boss" with a crown emoji. At 10, he checked locks and lights. At 11, he brushed his teeth in a bathroom that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. And around midnight, he lay under a heavy blanket listening to a house that didn't know him yet. Pipes ticked. The furnace filled its lungs and exhaled. Pepper launched off something in the dark and landed with the weight of a bowling ball beside his feet. At 1:19 a.m., he woke to the sound of wood sliding across wood. Not a bang, not a thud, a long, deliberate scrape, like someone dragging a chair a few inches across a floor. It came from directly overhead. Theo held still. The sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was heat shift and an old desk settling. He closed his eyes and tried not to listen so hard that every little sound became a decision he had to make. The second night, the scrape came twice. First at 12:47, quick, like a single adjustment. Then again around 2, longer, accompanied by the tiny shiver a house makes when something heavy changes its mind. He stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, telling himself that old houses and wind and age can mimic anything if you let them. Daylight dismantled the weird like daylight always does. Theo watered the ficus, which slurped it like a camel. He did a load of laundry because the washer and dryer in the mudroom fascinated him, with knobs labeled in font older than he was. He made pasta with too much garlic and FaceTimed his sister. "How's the haunted professor house? Tell the ghost to do your homework." He rolled his eyes and tilted the phone to show Pepper aggressively bathing her face on the window seat, unbothered by spectral domestic drama. "See, the queen is calm." On the third night, he was at the desk in the study, actually reading because he felt better downstairs, like the public part of the house had agreed to tolerate him. Snow had started around 9. Quiet, large flakes that thickened the world outside, turned the street lamps to paper lanterns, and made footsteps vanish. Pepper lay loafed on the radiator cover, eyes slitted, tail flicking once every forever. Theo made tea. Midnight slid past, and when 1:30 arrived, he looked up like he was waiting for a bus he didn't want to catch. The scrape came at 1:38. Longer. Slower. One long drag like a chair pulled from a table, then a pause, as if someone sat. It wasn't an ambiguous sound anymore. He'd dragged enough chairs in college housing to know it. The two-step voice of legs catching, releasing, wood registers complaining. He stood hard enough to knock his knee against the desk. Pepper lifted her head and stared at the ceiling the way a cat stares at a door you're pretending isn't important. He climbed the stairs with that embarrassing strategy of trying to step on the parts of the tread that maybe wouldn't betray him, which is to say he made more noise than if he'd just walked like a person. At the top, the hall lay narrow and blue with snowlight. The bathroom door breathed faint eucalyptus, and the bedroom smelled like detergent and sleep. The locked door waited like a polite older relative who had rules. Theo put his ear to the paint. Nothing. He almost laughed at himself. "It's the radiator," he whispered, and because that half sounded like a lie, he knocked once with his knuckles. A test, a neighborly hello to a room. He waited. From beyond the door, wood scraped slowly again, just an inch this time, like someone acknowledging him by shifting their chair. Theo's breath hitched and fogged the old paint where his lips hovered. He lowered his hands slowly. "Okay," he said to a door, as if that's a thing that works, and removed himself from that hallway with the kind of dignity you only manage when you don't turn your back. He slept on the couch. Pepper claimed the crook of his knees. The house went on breathing. He texted Dr. Bell in the morning. "House good, Pepper queen, ficus alive, random squeaks upstairs. Old houses, right?"
She replied with 3 thanks and a snowflake emoji, and after a pause, yes, very old. Theo knows now that this is where most stories lie to themselves. This is where you either decide the sound is pipes forever, or you decide you are a person in a story and act like it. He chose the first one for one more night, and then that choice stopped being available. On the 4th night, the scrape began earlier, 10:13. He was in the kitchen rinsing a mug when a chair dragged overhead with the kind of long patience that immediately invents a person in your imagination. He set the mug in the sink and stood with his hands wet and his whole body leaning toward the sound. "Pepper?" he said, ridiculous, because the cat was on the windowsill watching snow stick to snow. She didn't even glance at him. The sound came again, inch by inch. He realized then that his shoulders were up near his ears and put them down on purpose. He went upstairs. He stood before the door. It wasn't a bravado thing. He just got tired of the moment freezing him in place every time. He put the skeleton key in the keyhole because it was there and because his stomach already felt like he had. The metal turned with a reluctance that felt like either disuse or consent, and the latch gave. The room smelled like old paper and lemon oil. The air wasn't colder like he'd expected. It was simply still, the air of a space that hadn't been impatiently occupied in a long time. He turned on the switch and a single shaded lamp by a small writing desk bloomed to life. The desk had a blotter with a faint circle of sun bleach where a lamp used to sit, though the lamp was here now, like it had just wandered back. There was a narrow bed, a trunk with steamer stickers, and shelves of paperbacks from the late 70s and early 80s, spines browned. And in the center of the room, facing the window, a chair. It was one of those simple wooden kitchen chairs, scarred by years, the back worn smooth where hands had pushed it in and out of a table. Theo stood just over the threshold and looked for things he could measure. The chair's legs were naked to the floor, no felt sliders, no rug beneath it. He put his fingers down and could feel with his skin exactly how dragging it would sound here. He walked a slow circle as if not to spook the furniture. The window looked down on the street. Fresh snow negotiated with the porch railings. The shade was half raised like a held breath. The chair sat where a person would put it if they were keeping watch. A low bookcase near the wall held spiral notebooks with the loopy, urgent handwriting of someone taking notes during lectures that were either the most important or already too late. He put his hand lightly on the chair's back, and the warmth startled him. Not hot, not electric, the remembered warmth of a room that had held someone a few moments ago. He snatched his hand back and felt foolish immediately, like he'd offended a thing that wasn't a thing. He told himself stories to suit each detail. Maybe the radiator made the wood warm. Maybe the house settled and nudged the chair. Maybe draft under the door teased it along. But he couldn't invent a version of reality where the scrape he'd heard for 4 nights was anything but intention. He left the room gently, key turning the other way with the softest click, and went downstairs to send Dr. Bell the kind of message that lives halfway between honesty and politeness. "By the way, the upstairs room, is that okay to open? I thought I heard something and just checked for leaks." She erased that. She wrote instead, "Is there anything special I should know about the locked room, just so I don't mess up your system?" Her reply took 3 hours. When it arrived, it was short. "Please keep that door closed at night. Thank you." He stared at the screen, thumb hovering, and felt that specific cold of being told the exact thing you hoped no one was going to say. He typed, "Got it." The 5th night, Theo moved the chair himself. He dragged it 6 inches to the left, the sound crisp and accurate, and when it ended, the quiet that followed surprised him by feeling like accusation. He placed one of Pepper's jingly mice on the seat like an offering or a scientific marker,
If it was on the floor in the morning, then a cat had done a cat thing, or a house had done a house thing, or a person had done a thing, and he wasn't ready for the third option. At 2:11 a.m., the scrape woke him. It wasn't a single confident pull, but a slow, inchworming sound, as if the chair didn't want to misjudge the night. He lay in bed and let it happen, because he didn't know how not to. The scrape would stop for 3 breaths, like someone listening to see if he'd listen, then start again with the rubbery patience of repetition. It went on for 4 minutes, and then the room upstairs exhaled. He felt it, ridiculous as that sounds, as if the act of sitting had opinions about completion. He went up in the morning with the bravado that tea and sunlight put in your bones, and found the chair returned to its original place. Pepper's jingly mouse lay on the floor, 2 feet away, facing the window like a thing that had considered joining a different life and then sat down instead. He picked it up carefully, that silly toy heavier than it was. He left the chair where it wanted to be. He is not proud of that sentence, but it is true. The 6th night, snow turned to ice. The house made glass music, branches tapping the siding and the sound of melting, refreezing in the gutters. Theo stuck to the downstairs and set the TV to a cooking competition with the volume up a little too high. Midnight came, then 1. The scrape began at 1:03, earlier than usual, confident. He put down the remote carefully and, against what he believed about himself, climbed the stairs. At the top, he paused because he realized the scrape had rhythm now. 3 inches, rest, 1 inch, rest. Then the faintest answering drag as if a second leg had caught up. He pictured the chair rotating to face a different window, to attend to some appointment the room kept nightly, and that act of imagining felt like crossing a line. At the door, he didn't use the key. He put his ear to the paint and heard, just on the other side, cloth shift. Not a voice, not a person clearing a throat, the sound a sleeve makes near wood. He kept his hands at his sides, because every cell of his body wanted to knock, and he already knew what would answer. The scrape went once more, short, tidy. The house steadied around it. When morning arrived, he did a cowardly thing. He moved into the study with his sleeping bag, and called that a plan. He texted Dr. Bell his daily cat photo. Pepper has notes about the ficus. She says it could be greener. Dr. Bell replied with a laughing emoji, and then, a minute later, "Thank you. 2 more nights." The 7th night, he woke to Pepper staring at the stairs. Cats look like statues until they decide to look like weather. She looked like both. The scrape upstairs carried the ease of habit. Theo whispered, "Okay, okay, okay," to no God, and stood. He had decided, with the sudden spine of someone tired of not deciding, that he was going to put the chair somewhere else and see what the night did. He got the skeleton key, climbed quietly, and slid the metal into the keyhole. It turned without squeal. He pushed the door an inch. No dramatic gust, no cinematic cold, just the everyday smell of dust and someone's books that had learned the shape of this air. He opened the door the rest of the way. The chair was already facing him. It sat 2 feet from the threshold, centered as if whoever had arranged this little house's theater had measured the distance from his surprise. The lamp on the desk was on, though he had not turned it. Warm coin of light finding familiar edges. And on the chair's seat lay the jingly mouse, tail curled soft, as if it had been placed the way a person puts a key down when they intend to come back. He picked it up carefully, that silly toy heavier than it was. He left the chair where it wanted to be. He is not proud of that sentence, but it is true. He said, "I'll close it now," because he suddenly understood not speaking would be worse. He picked up the mouse and put it back on the shelf with the paperbacks. He put both hands on the chair back, and because he can be stubborn enough to be honest, he tried to move it a fraction. It did not move, not stuck, not heavy, simply finished, the way a hand on a shoulder communicates end of conversation, without a word. He left the lamp on, because turning it off felt like pretending no one lived here. He closed the door. the key turned. Pepper, having supervised the hallway with professional disapproval, led him back downstairs. Dr. Bell returned 2 days later with a thank you check folded into a note that said, "You took good care of my house, and Pepper, and the ficus is alive, which is something of a miracle." She stood with Theo on the porch, with cold air between them, and said, looking over his shoulder rather than at him, "Did you open the back room?" He nodded. She nodded too, the small nod of someone whose suspicions have been confirmed by a witness who doesn't know all the questions yet. "That was my brother's room for a long time," she said. "He moved out decades ago, but some nights, when he visits for holidays, he'll stand in that doorway, look at the chair, and say, 'You kept my place.'" She rubbed her gloved hands together, as if accepting an object from the air. The house remembers where people sit. Theo wanted to ask the 100 questions that sentence birthed, but Dr. Bell pressed the skeleton key into his palm and said, "Keep this, just for luck. Sometimes houses behave better for people who have their keys." He laughed because adults are awkward and gratitude needed a sound. He left the porch with the key heavy in his pocket, enough metal to explain the pull in his coat. That night, in his dorm room, he woke at 1:38 to the distinct impression of wood sliding across wood, though his floor was concrete and his chair had rubber feet. He has not slept in anyone else's spare room since. He will sit at kitchen tables, yes. He'll watch a movie and fall asleep on couches when friends insist. But if a house offers him a guest room with a single chair facing a window, he will tell a small white lie about allergies or a paper due in the morning and go home instead. Sometimes, when he visits Dr. Bell, because she writes recommendation letters like they can hold the world's weight, he'll glance up her staircase and feel the brief physical memory of turning a key in a lock and saying, out loud, "I'll close it now," to a room that understood him better than he understood himself. Before you go, if you were alone in that house and heard a chair dragging over your head, would you open the door or pretend you hadn't? Tell me in the comments. Your story might be featured in a future video. If slow burn horror like this keeps you up, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day.
The third story comes from a woman living in a townhouse who began hearing whispers through her heating vents, except the basement door was locked from the inside. By the end, you'll understand why she stopped staying there overnight altogether. For more horror stories like these, make sure you hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Elaine, who had just moved into a small townhouse after a messy breakup. It wasn't the dream place she'd been picturing. 2 floors, dated beige carpets, and a kitchen with counters just beginning to peel, but it was hers. She paid the rent, decorated it with thrift store finds, and told herself that living alone meant finally having quiet. The quiet was exactly what she loved about it in the beginning. The townhouse complex sat on the edge of town, and her unit faced a narrow patch of woods instead of the parking lot. She could sit on the couch with a blanket and tea, look out at the trees, and feel like the world had left her in peace. But as winter settled in and the heat began running more often, Elaine noticed something strange. One night she was brushing her teeth when the air vent above the bathroom mirror gave a soft hiss. Normal enough, but layered under the hum of warm air, she swore she heard a sound that didn't belong. A faint rise and fall, like someone murmuring through fabric. She froze, toothbrush halfway to her mouth. The hiss continued, steady, but there it was again. A low whisper, too faint to pick apart, almost like a radio playing in another room.
She turned off the fan, cupped her hand around her ear, and held her breath. The hiss of the vent seemed louder in the silence, and the whisper rose with it, two voices now, overlapping in a strange, syncopated rhythm. Her skin prickled. Elaine shook herself out of it. The townhouse was old. Maybe the ducts carried sound from another unit. Maybe she was overhearing her neighbors arguing or watching TV. She finished brushing, shut the bathroom door firmly, and laughed it off. But it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough. Always when she was alone, always when the vents kicked on. A low, indistinct whisper, sometimes one voice, sometimes two. Never loud, never clear, just on the edge of hearing, just enough to make her lean closer, straining to catch words she never could. One evening in January, she had a friend over for dinner. They sat at the table talking about work when the furnace clicked on. Elaine tensed automatically, but forced herself to keep smiling. Then she noticed her friend frown. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Elaine's stomach dropped. "Hear what?" "Like talking." He tilted his head toward the vent near the ceiling. "It's faint. Maybe your neighbors." She laughed too quickly, too high-pitched. "Yeah, probably. The walls are thin." But inside, she felt a cold, sinking dread. It wasn't just her imagination. A few nights later, she decided to test it. She shut off the TV, the phone, every sound in the townhouse, and waited. When the furnace clicked on, the hiss filled the air. And there it was. Clearer this time. Not words exactly, but syllables, like consonants pressed through static. She followed the sound, from the living room vent to the kitchen, up the stairs, into the bedroom. Always the same. The whispers moved with her, filling each vent as though trailing her footsteps. When she reached the small door at the end of the hall, the one leading to the basement staircase, the sound grew sharper. Not louder, but more distinct, like she was closer to the source. She tried the knob. Locked. She jiggled it again, frowning. The landlord had told her the basement was sealed, that no tenants were supposed to use it. The key hadn't been provided. He'd said, "Old wiring, unfinished floor, not safe to mess with. Don't worry about it." But the whispers seemed to be coming from there, from the locked, unseen space beneath her feet. Elaine told herself she could live with it. She played podcasts at night, left the TV on low volume, anything to drown out the hiss. But one evening, in February, the furnace kicked on while she was in bed, and this time the voice was different. It wasn't faint. It wasn't muffled. It was a single voice, right at the edge of the vent near her bed. Elaine. Her name. Clear. Deliberate. She sat bolt upright, heart slamming against her ribs. She stared at the vent as though it would explain itself. Nothing. Just warm air rushing through. The next morning she called the landlord, demanding answers. He swore no one had access to the basement. No utilities crews, no maintenance. The ductwork didn't connect to the neighboring units. "I've had people in that townhouse for 15 years, he said. "You're the first to complain about noise." Elaine almost believed him, until that night, when she heard it again. Elaine. This time followed by a second voice, whispering fast, as though answering. She slept in the living room with every light on. The last night in that townhouse was the one she doesn't like to talk about, but she told me anyway. It was March, a wet, windy evening that rattled the siding. She'd been curled on the couch with Pepper, the cat she'd adopted for company, when the power flickered. The furnace clicked off, then back on, and the whisper came immediately, layered, urgent, as though whoever it was had been waiting. This time she stood. She walked slowly to the basement door, pulse thundering. She pressed her ear to the wood, and she heard them. Two voices, distinct, arguing in a language she didn't understand, low and fast, sometimes overlapping, sometimes pausing as though listening for her. Her breath fogged the door. Her hand hovered on the knob. And then, just as she was about to step back, the lock clicked. From the inside. Elaine bolted. She grabbed her keys, her cat, her bag, and drove to a friend's house without looking back. When she returned the next day with the landlord, the basement door was locked tight again. He unlocked it with a master key, muttering under his breath, and opened it onto a dark, unfinished stairwell. Dust, cobwebs, concrete floor, no sign of anyone living there. But when Elaine glanced at the vent shaft running along the ceiling, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Handprints. Faint, smudged into the dust, small and large as though several people had pressed their palms flat against the metal from below. She moved out within a week. And even now, years later, she says she can't fall asleep if a vent is near her bed. She'll move furniture, pile books, anything to block it, because she knows what it feels like to hear your name whispered from the dark, carried on a breath that doesn't belong to anyone you can see. Before you go, would you have pressed your ear to that door? Or gotten out the moment you heard your name? If chilling horror stories like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day.
The fourth story comes from a man who woke to find his living room glowing faintly in the middle of the night, the television playing a feed of someone else's home. By the end, you'll understand why he unplugged every device in his house and never sleeps in silence again. If eerie horror stories like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Daniel, who was 31 at the time and living in a rented duplex on the outskirts of a small Ohio town. He'd moved there after a breakup, too broke to afford much more than a furnished unit with mismatched appliances and furniture that felt like it had been collected from garage sales. Still, it was clean, it was his, and for the first few weeks, it was the first time in months he could breathe. Daniel wasn't much of a night owl, but he had a bad habit of falling asleep on the couch with the TV playing. It was old, a chunky flat screen that took forever to boot up, with a dent in the corner from a previous tenant. His landlord had told him the cable package was spotty, but insisted the set worked fine. It was late January when he first noticed the glow. He woke at 2:30 a.m., head foggy, mouth dry. The TV was on, casting a bluish light across the room. At first, he thought nothing of it. He'd left it on plenty of times. But as his eyes adjusted, something about the picture froze him. It wasn't a channel. No sitcom reruns, no late-night commercials. The screen showed what looked like a living room. Not his living room, not any he recognized, but someone else's. The camera angle was strange, too. Low, fixed, as if taken from near the floor. A beige couch, a coffee table with water rings, a window covered with floral curtains. And on that couch, a man slept. Daniel sat perfectly still, staring at the image, his pulse in his ears. The man was middle-aged, unshaven, bundled in a blanket. The picture was grainy, almost black and white, but Daniel could make out the slow rise and fall of his chest. It was live. He fumbled for the remote, hands clumsy, and jabbed the power button. The screen went black. Relief rushed through him so quickly he almost laughed. It had to be some late-night show, a film, a security feed accidentally picked up by old wiring. He convinced himself of that. He stumbled upstairs to his bed, shoved the thought aside, and eventually slept. But the next night, it happened again. At 2:41 a.m., he woke to the glow. The TV was on. This time, the screen showed a different room. A kitchen, narrow, linoleum floor, a fridge with magnets and notes. The feed was angled high, like from the top of a cabinet. A woman stood at the counter, not moving much, just standing, back to the camera, hair falling long and dark over her shoulders. At first, Daniel thought she was cooking, but her hands didn't move. She stood perfectly still, as though listening for something. He gripped the blanket so tight his knuckles hurt. Then the woman turned her head just slightly toward the camera. The screen went black. Daniel didn't sleep the rest of the night. The third time broke him. It was a week later. He'd forced himself to turn the TV off before bed, double-check the cords, even unplugged it from the wall. He slept upstairs, determined not to give the living room a chance to glow. At 3:06 a.m., light still woke him. He stumbled downstairs, heart in his throat. The TV was on. Plugged back in, humming softly, glow spilling across the room. The screen showed his staircase. Narrow, carpeted, with wooden banisters. The angle was low, as if placed at the bottom, looking up. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was his staircase, the very one he was standing at the top of. He froze, unable to breathe. The image showed the stairs from below, empty for now, light from the second floor spilling down. His own hand, trembling, gripped the railing, and in that exact moment, he saw it reflected on the screen. The image was live. He bolted back into his bedroom, slammed the door, and barricaded it with a chair. He sat awake until morning. Every creak of the house made him flinch. When daylight came, he unplugged the TV again, wrapped the cord in tape, and shoved the whole set into the hall closet. But even with it gone, he couldn't shake the fear that something was watching. Something that wanted him to see. He called the landlord that day, babbling about interference, bad wiring, dangerous feeds. The landlord brushed him off. Old houses pick up things. Don't worry about it. Daniel considered getting rid of the TV entirely, but something stopped him. A mix of fear and fascination, maybe. What if it wasn't the TV? What if, no matter what, the glow would come back? He lasted one more night. He woke again at 3 a.m. to light flickering under his door. When he opened it, his blood went cold. The TV was back in the living room. He hadn't touched it. It hadn't been moved from the closet, yet there it was, plugged in, humming. The screen showed his bedroom. The camera was angled from the corner, near the ceiling. He saw himself lying under the blanket just minutes before, and on the bed, behind him, a shadow. Tall, lean, standing perfectly still, head bent as if watching him sleep. Daniel slammed the remote at the power button, but the screen didn't go dark. He yanked the plug from the wall. The glow dimmed, then flared again, screen lighting up even without power. The shadow moved. That was enough. Daniel grabbed his keys, ran out into the freezing night without shoes, and drove till dawn. He never went back for the TV. When he broke his lease a month later, the landlord charged him for the missing set. Daniel didn't argue. Now he refuses to have a television in his house at all. He says that when he visits friends, he can't help but staring at the black surface of their screens, waiting for the glow to return. Before you go, would you have kept watching that feed or destroyed the TV the first night? If eerie horror stories like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day.
The fifth story comes from a girl who stayed in her grandmother's farmhouse and kept hearing knocking from a room that had been locked for decades, and discovered the lock was on the inside. By the end, you'll understand why she never slept down that hallway again. If unsettling horror stories like this pulls you in, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Heather, who was 17 when she spent a week with her grandmother in rural Pennsylvania. Her grandmother's house was one of those sprawling farmhouses built before central heating, all long hallways and rooms that had been added on at different times, giving the layout a lopsided, almost dreamlike feel. Heather had always loved visiting, though. There was something about the smell of the place.
baked bread, wood polish, and faint lavender that made her feel safe. But her grandmother was getting older, her health slipping, and Heather's parents asked her to stay for a few nights to keep her company. Her grandmother gave her the guest room on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway with creaky floorboards and wallpaper that had begun to curl at the seams. Across from the guest room was another door. Heavy oak, painted white but chipped with age, the brass knob tarnished to a dull green. It had always been locked, for as long as Heather could remember. When she was little, she'd asked about it. "That's the sewing room," her grandmother had said, voice clipped. "We don't go in there anymore." That first night, Heather settled into the guest bed with her phone, scrolling until her eyes ached. Around midnight, when she finally set it down, she noticed how quiet the house was. Not silent exactly, more like the house was listening. And then she heard it. 3 soft knocks. From across the hall. She froze, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes, the wind. But after a long stretch of silence, the knocks came again. This time, 4. She sat up, heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was knocking from inside the locked sewing room. Heather forced herself to laugh quietly. Old houses do things, she told herself. She slipped out of bed, padded down the hall, and pressed her ear against the locked door. Nothing. Just her own breath fogging the wood. She shook the knob. It didn't budge. She whispered, "Hello?" Silence. Back in bed, she lay awake for hours, staring at the faint glow of her phone screen, waiting for the knocks to return. They didn't. The next day, Heather asked her grandmother casually about the sewing room. Her grandmother stiffened. "That door stays shut. Don't give it any attention." That answer unsettled Heather more than the knocking. The second night, the knocks returned. Longer this time, louder. Not frantic, more like insistent, as though someone was asking politely, firmly, to be let out. Heather pressed her pillow over her ears, but she could still feel the vibration through the floorboards. She considered waking her grandmother, but something about the thought made her hesitate. If her grandmother really knew what was behind that door, did Heather want to hear the explanation? The third night, she couldn't take it anymore. When the knocks began again, measured, steady, she climbed out of bed and went to the door. Her hand shook as she reached for the knob. Locked, of course, but when she bent down to peer at the keyhole, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The keyhole wasn't facing outward. The small, jagged slot for a key was on the inside. The door wasn't locked to keep people out. It was locked to keep something in. Heather stumbled back, her throat tight. The knocks came again, faster now, as though responding to her discovery. Panicked, she ran downstairs and slept on the couch in the living room, lights blazing. In the morning, she didn't tell her grandmother what she'd seen. She couldn't find the words. Instead, she told her parents she couldn't stay another night. They picked her up that evening, and she never spent the night in that farmhouse again. Years later, after her grandmother passed, Heather's family cleaned out the house. When they finally opened the sewing room door, the space was empty. Dust everywhere, shelves bare, nothing unusual, except the marks on the inside of the door. Scratches. Dozens of them. Long, shallow grooves like fingernails dragged across the wood from the inside, circling the knob. Heather swears the house felt lighter once the door was open, like the hallway had been holding its breath for decades. But she still won't talk about what she heard those nights, alone at the end of that hall, with someone knocking gently, patiently, for her to answer.
The sixth story comes from a young man who slept in his parents' spare room and discovered the mirror inside didn't reflect the house he knew, but a darker version of it. By the end, you'll understand why he never set foot in that room again. If unsettling horror stories like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. This account comes from Colin, who was 24 at the time. His parents had gone on a 2-week vacation and asked him to stay at their house while they were away. It was an easy gig: water the plants, bring in the mail, and keep an eye on the place. Colin didn't mind. He lived in a cramped apartment across town, and the thought of having a whole house to himself felt like a free upgrade. The house was big enough that it sometimes felt cavernous without his parents in it. A 2-story colonial with wide windows, creaky staircases, and a spare bedroom they mostly used for visiting relatives. Colin decided he'd sleep there instead of in his old childhood room. Something about the bigger bed and the quiet appealed to him. The spare room had a queen-sized bed, 2 mismatched nightstands, and one thing that immediately caught Colin's attention: a tall, antique mirror leaning against the far wall. It wasn't one of those clean-lined mirrors you buy at a department store. This one looked old, its frame carved from dark wood with ornate spirals and floral etchings. The glass had faint ripples in it, the kind that distort reflections just enough to remind you of age. The first night, Colin settled in with a book, the glow of the bedside lamp warm against the wallpaper. The mirror reflected him as expected: hair messy, glasses slipping down his nose, book in hand. He found it oddly comforting. But at around 2 a.m., he woke suddenly. The room was still. The house groaned the way it always did, wood shifting with temperature. But something felt off. His eyes drifted toward the mirror. At first, everything looked normal: the bed, the lamp, his own reflection. Then he noticed the shadows. In the mirror, the corners of the room seemed darker, not just dim, but thick, like the glass held onto shadow longer than reality. He sat up, staring. His reflection mirrored him, movements exact, but the background didn't match perfectly. The wallpaper behind his reflection seemed more faded, the floorboards duller, like he was looking at a slightly older version of the room. Colin rubbed his eyes, muttered, "I'm overtired," and forced himself to lie back down. Eventually, he drifted back to sleep. The next morning in daylight, the mirror was perfectly ordinary. But the second night, the difference was impossible to ignore. He was lying in bed, scrolling his phone, when movement in the mirror caught his eye. It was subtle, just enough to pull his gaze up. In his reflection, the lamp flickered. But in the real room, the lamp beside him glowed steady. His throat tightened. "Nope," he whispered, tossing the blanket aside. He unplugged the lamp in reality and turned off the phone flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. But in the mirror, the lamp stayed on. It cast a faint, sickly yellow glow across the reflected bed where his reflection stared back at him with wide, identical eyes. Colin slept downstairs on the couch that night. The third night, he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Stress, fatigue, leftover nerves from being alone in a big house. But curiosity won. He decided to test the mirror. He stood in front of it around midnight, holding a glass of water. He raised it slowly. His reflection matched. He tipped it to his lips. His reflection tipped it too. Everything was normal.
But when he set the glass on the nightstand, his reflection hesitated, just for a beat. A fraction of a second where the reflected glass hovered before clinking down onto wood. Colin's skin crawled. He leaned closer. His reflection leaned too, but behind him, in the mirrored version of the room, he swore he saw something shift in the shadows near the door. Something tall, too tall. He spun around. The real room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, The shadow was gone. He barely slept, nerves buzzing like wires. On the fourth night, things escalated. Colin tried ignoring the mirror, keeping his eyes shut tight. But around 3 a.m., a faint sound pulled him awake. A scratching, soft and steady, like fingernails on wood. He sat up, heart pounding, and realized the sound was coming from the mirror. He turned on the lamp. His reflection did the same, but in the mirror's version, something was wrong. The wallpaper looked water-stained. The bed sagged deeper, older. And behind his reflection, faint marks lined the wall where the mirror leaned, long vertical scratches that didn't exist in his real room. The scratching continued, even though his reflection's hands stayed perfectly still. Colin stumbled out of bed, grabbed the mirror by its frame, and shoved it face down against the wall. The sound stopped instantly. He slept on the couch again, sweat cold on his skin. By the fifth night, he couldn't shake the dread. He told himself he'd stay in his old childhood room instead, but when he went upstairs to grab clothes from the spare room, the mirror had been propped back up. He hadn't touched it. And this time, the reflection didn't match him. He stood frozen in the doorway, staring. His reflection was already at the mirror, close, peering back at him with a too-wide grin. Behind it, the room looked rotten. Peeling wallpaper, warped floors, shadows twitching unnaturally. Colin bolted. He slammed the door shut, ran downstairs, and didn't look back. He spent the rest of the 2 weeks in his apartment, visiting the house only during daylight to water plants and grab the mail. When his parents returned, he didn't say a word about the mirror. But a few months later, during a family dinner, his mom mentioned casually, "Funny thing, we finally moved that old mirror out of the spare room. It kept sliding away from the wall on its own." Colin excused himself from the table, suddenly pale. To this day, he won't be in the same room as an antique mirror. He avoids thrift stores, skips estate sales, and even covers mirrors in hotel rooms with towels before going to sleep. Because he knows that sometimes the reflection isn't showing your world at all. It's showing the one that's waiting for you. Before you go, would you have tested the mirror or left it alone the first night you noticed the difference? Share your answer in the comments. If chilling, immersive horror like this keeps you hooked, hit subscribe and ring the bell. I post new stories every single day. Until then, keep your mirrors covered after dark. Some reflections don't belong to you. Sweet dreams.